Very warm welcome to everyone who's here in the room, to everyone who is joining in through the live stream, and to everyone who will watch this panel discussion later on our YouTube channel. A very warm welcome. I'm really excited about this panel in which we will discuss Dr. Lisa Powell's book, The Disabled God Revisited. I'm with Professor Powell herself. So really excited for this. This panel is jointly organized by the Center for Autism and Theology and the Aberdeen Center for Protestant Theology, both here at the University of Aberdeen. My name is Leon van Ommen, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Center for Autism and Theology. Those of you who are familiar with disability theology have no doubt heard about Nancy Eiesland's influential book, The Disabled God, which you can see here, written in 1994. Perhaps the book became most well known for Eiesland's image of God, the disabled God, a God who sits in a puff chair. A puff chair is a wheelchair controlled by breathing. Nancy Eiesland's book underlies Lisa Powell's book, and I guess also the title, The Disabled God Revisited, in which Lisa Powell traces some of the theological paths that Nancy Eiesland traveled, but that these are not always developed fully. As such, Powell's book does much work in underpinning some of the theological claims of Eiesland's book. And so it's a real pleasure to welcome Lisa in our midst today. Thank you very much for being here. Dr. Lisa Powell is a professor of theology and Director of Justice, Diversity and Gender Studies at Ambrose University in Davenport, Iowa, United States. Her scholarship examines the intersections of doctrine, liberation theology, and justice. She is author of the book just mentioned and other books and articles. We have invited 3 panelists to respond to Dr. Powell's book, and it is my pleasure to introduce each of them to you, which I will do quite briefly so that we have more time for the Q&A and for the responses that they will give. First of all, Professor Grant McCaskill over there, welcome and thank you for being here. Professor McCaskill is the Kirby Lang Chair of New Testament Exegesis here at the University of Aberdeen. He has authored numerous books and articles, but perhaps for today the most relevant to mention is his book Autism and the Church. He is also the founding co-director of the Center for Autism and Theology. The next panelist that I should introduce is Professor Bruce McCormack. Professor McCormack joined the University of Aberdeen last year as chair of modern theology, after having been at Princeton Theological Seminary for 39 years. His interpretation of covenantal theology and the Trinity is an important strand in Lisa Powell's book. Unfortunately, due to health reasons, Bruce McCormack cannot be here himself today, but his response that he prepared will be read by Dr. Hannah Cundill. Over there. Dr. Cundill recently joined the Divinity staff here at Aberdeen as the Hope Trust postdoctoral fellow researching ADHD and discipleship, and also as postdoctoral fellow in practical theology. As part of that role, she is also the coordinator for impact and public engagement for the Center for Autism and Theology. Last, but certainly not least, Audrey Quay, is that the right pronunciation? Audrey Quay, who is a solicitor who has founded 2 social enterprises in Singapore and is currently a PhD student here in Aberdeen. She engages church and theology in a post-colonial context of Singapore and Southeast Asia more broadly through the lens of autism. Can I invite you to welcome our panel members? Practically, the panel will run as follows. First, Lisa Powell will highlight some salient aspects of her book for about 5 to 10 minutes. And then each panelist will respond for about, I guess, 10 minutes each. First, we will hear a response from Grant McCaskill, then Bruce McCormack, as read by Hannah Cundill, and then Audrey Quay. After that, we will give the floor back to Lisa Powell for a short response, and then we'll have a break. During the break, you can ask your questions. Well, you can actually already start asking questions through Mentimeter, if that works. Yeah, so you see a QR code. If you scan the code, it will take you to Mentimeter, where you can type your questions. Well, two final notes. Some of you might notice that the lighting is slightly reduced. We do that to accommodate some people with neurodivergences. Obviously, as Center for Autism and Theology, that is something we are keenly aware of, that for some people, there might be sensory things that need accommodation. And of course, we want to do that. That's also, by the way, the reason why we use Mentimeter, because it kind of levels the playing field if you want. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Powell.
All right, thank you for having me. Can everyone hear me okay in the room? I can't hear it very well from the back, so I wasn't sure. Okay. All right, I've been asked to say a few things to introduce my book for the panel, and I don't want to repeat everything I said in my lengthy lecture on Friday. So I'm going to focus in on an aspect of the book that I didn't comment on at all on Friday, and that is the final chapter of the book. And I know at least one respondent will have some notes to give me on this chapter. So I feel I should introduce that chapter briefly and how it relates to Eiesland's claim that God is disabled and my argument as a whole. As I mentioned Friday, Eiesland claimed God is disabled based upon the resurrected wounds of Christ, which he presumably took with him back to the Father. So the idea is that Christ retained his impairment throughout the eschatological life. Christ, as the first fruits of the resurrected body, shows us what our resurrected bodies might be like. And for Eiesland, this signifies that impairments are retained in our resurrected bodies, but without struggle or pain. This has been one of the most controversial or popular and contested claims of Eiesland's. For many with disabilities, this is an affirmation that their bodies are embraced by God and welcomed into the kingdom of God as they are. As an aside, I will note here, you might notice that I didn't say that their body minds are embraced and welcomed as they are, because Eiesland's book almost exclusively deals with physical disability, and she names that at the beginning. She says, I'm really only dealing with physical disability. And so her book really emphasizes physical impairment being retained into the eschaton. And she is certainly critiqued for focusing almost exclusively on physical disability, which is also true of the disability rights movement of her era, and of disability studies in general, especially early on. And I'll give one example. There was a study in Disability Studies Quarterly that demonstrated that the articles in their own journal assume physical disability when disability is named, but give other disabilities qualifiers, such as developmental disability or intellectual disability, and so on. But physical disability can just be disability. So this tendency toward just assuming disability and then qualifying others is certainly true of Eiesland's work, but we find it persists in a lot of work within disability studies. Okay, so back to Eiesland's claim that retain impairments into the resurrected life. It's controversial not only for this neglect of other forms of disability, but even among those with physical disabilities, it is contested. So those with congenital disabilities are much more supportive of her claim, typically. But those with degenerative or acquired impairments, which likely occurred through trauma or illness, tend to be critical of her affirmation that we retain these particular bodies throughout life everlasting. So we typically seem to want our bodies restored to their highest previous level of ability, which is frankly how most theologians, especially early theologians, understood our resurrected bodies. We sort of, maybe we come back at age 33, or we come back at sort of the height of our, for those of you who are under 33, little did you know that 33 is, well, probably the age they speculate Jesus was resurrected, and we all receive a body that was similar to Jesus's. But all right. So I take inspiration from Eiesland, obviously, and agree that Jesus is our model for resurrected life. And I also follow a tradition that says the Christian life culminates in becoming like Christ, or of putting on Christ. Thus, in the final chapter, I argue that the identity categories that society constructs melt away in the eschaton as we become more and more like Christ, who is constituted in this interdependent relationship of the hypostatic union, which I talked about at length on Friday. And I follow the work here of Amos Young to some extent, who wrote a massive book on theology and disability, but specifically on theology and Down syndrome. That's the name of his book, where he thinks about resurrected life, what it might look like for his brother with Down syndrome. He asks, will his brother Mark suddenly be reconstituted with less chromosomes that he was born with, right? And then in that transformation, will he be a radically different person? Will he be unrecognizable if he is changed in that way? And so Young borrows from Gregory of Nyssa to think about eschatological life as a never-ending process of growing in knowledge of and love for God. So Young speculates that his brother enters eschatological life truly as he was in life, but that we will all, as will his brother Mark, go through this process of becoming more and more knowledgeable of God, more and more in love with God, growing toward that perfect love forever, never reaching it, because we can never love and know God perfectly. So I do borrow from Young in that I see this sort of ongoing transformation of eschatological life. But I argue further that increasingly growing more like Christ, we will become ever more interdependent in this communal future, where ability itself ceases to be a coherent identity category. And so disability also loses its meaning, as we may all be identified as disabled in some sense, and that our identities, like Christ's, are manifest in the relationality of giving and receiving without end. But I'm not going to say any more now on the topic, as I don't want to curtail the critique that I believe is coming. So we'll leave it there, and I look forward to a lively conversation. Thank you.
So before I start, I'll just mention I need to keep my mask on. I'm a carer for someone who's been left disabled by COVID. So I just need to keep my mask on so that I protect from any further transmission. So hopefully you can still hear me through all of this. I'm really glad that we've had the opportunity to host this session looking at Lisa's book. Since its release, it's been one of the books I've mentioned most often in relation to our work on autism and theology. And I'm grateful for a chance to say a little bit more about that today. What I really appreciate about the book is the intentional care that it pays to how the task of theology, discourse concerning God's self, is properly defined and shaped in its distinctively Christian forms by Christology. So that's a way of saying there are other ways of approaching theology, but in its Christian forms, it's distinctively defined by Christology, the discourse concerning Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ. Now, I think this is really relevant to the theological discussion of autism because many of those properly recognized to be stakeholders in that conversation as autistic people aren't necessarily aware of the history of theological discussion or the principles by which it's regulated and evaluated. They're not, in other words, formed in the practices of theology. This creates a particular susceptibility within the discourse and within advocacy that's associated with it to theological formulations that are less careful than they need to be and may be formed inappropriately, either under the direct influence of bad popular theology or the legitimate but not necessarily helpful reactions to bad popular theology. Now, I think we do need to recognize that the history of theological discussion that I just mentioned and the principles by which it's regulated may be shaped by some of the very normativities that many of us want to challenge. Heteronormativity, color, androcentricity, and interestingly, in the case of autism, neurotypicality. At its best, though, the tradition has recognized the danger of projecting onto God the valorization of particular embodiments of human identity, insisting that in key senses, the tradition insists that in key senses, God is precisely not like us, is precisely other, while at the same time affirming through Christology an essential solidarity, a correspondence between the uncreated God and the creature. Now, the kind of careful attention to Christology that Lisa pays allows us to challenge a modern trend towards thinking, and I hate doing scare quotes, but I need to do them here. So it challenges, I think, a modern trend towards thinking of the relational God in essentially neurotypical categories, which are often connected to science-engaged approaches to the image of God, the Imago Dei, that use autism precisely as a representation of anti-relationality, a deformed or deficient black mirror of the true image of God, incapable of properly responsive agency. And as soon as I've said that, I should apologize because I should have given a trigger warning that I was going to talk about this. But there are people who will talk about autistic minds and autistic identities as if they're fundamentally opposed to the idea of what the image of God is, and allow us to get some kind of intellectual purchase on the image of God by showing us what God is absolutely not like. And there's something fundamentally problematic about that I think in crucial ways Lisa's approach allows us to challenge. But it also allows us to develop at the same time, I think, a theologically careful response to a question that I've been asked quite a number of times over the years in response to my own work. Is God autistic? Can we speak about God properly as an autistic God? And to answer that question properly without simply mirroring the problematic move made by the neurotypically relational God approaches, and without potentially introducing new normalcies associated with particular experiences of autism, that requires the kind of attention to Christology that Lisa makes and that Lisa pays. So crucially, I think by her use of the categories of covenant and election, this can be done in a way that affirms the intentional uniting of the particular embodied human realities of autism to the eternal life of God by God's own decision, but in a way that retains the unique role of Jesus Christ as distinctively the image of God in the mediation of that intentional election. I shouldn't elaborate off the cuff, but Jesus is the one who's identified at a number of points in the New Testament as the image of God in a way that is fundamentally distinctive. And for me, what's useful and important about that in relation to autism is if we insist on his unique status as the image of God and insist on all other human imaging as in some sense contingent on his, then it requires us to insist on a certain degree of removal from any particular embodied identity. It requires us to refrain from identifying any particular embodied identity as corresponding to the image of God in a way that other embodied identities don't. So there's something, I think, particularly potent about that. Now, by stressing the priority of the divine choice and the divine knowing of autism in the way that this does, this, I think, usefully addresses one of the key problems in many of the theological treatments of autism, which cannot conceive of relationality apart from subjective agency. Lisa's approach, particularly in its attentiveness to the receptive character of Jesus as an object or recipient of divine choice and election, allows ways of thinking about the relational constitution of the person in a way that emphasizes their passivity in this, and in a way that helpfully, I think, allows us to move away from an overemphasis on capacity for responsive reciprocity, where accounts of the humanity of a person depend on the perception that they are able intentionally to respond to the involvement of another in a particular way, which excludes a whole lot of people who don't have that kind of capacity for intentionality. By focusing on Christology, particularly in the categories that Lisa does with her emphasis on receptivity as a constitutive quality of Jesus Christ, there's all kinds, I think, of potential significance for our discourse. Now, I think this is pastorally important, particularly in the context of churches that are still influenced by these science-engaged, and I have to say not very theological, ways of thinking about God and God's image. But I also think it's massively significant for dialogue across religious boundaries, particularly with Jewish and Muslim thinkers. The latter in particular share a significant body of philosophical discussion with classical Christian theology about the nature of God and what's required if we're to speak properly about the relationship between God and the world. There's actually a wealth of material representing dialogue across the borders in medieval Arabic literature. If we're genuinely global in our vision for autism and theology, we have to be able to communicate meaningfully and respectfully across borders. This kind of emphasis on Christology helps us to see how that can be done without erasing or eliding the deep and necessary differences that distinguish the traditions. There's much held in common between these different traditions, but if they're to talk to each other in constructive ways, it's also important to acknowledge that there are necessarily emic, internal, interior qualities to each tradition. So having said all of this, let me just finish with a question. I'm interested in the role that Lisa sees for pneumatology in her project, particularly as it continues to grow. Now, pneumatology, the study of the spirit, is threaded through this book, and I think I want to acknowledge and to emphasize that. But I wonder if there's a place for some more sustained, dedicated attention precisely to this topic. It's in part a question about the fully Trinitarian quality of our project, but it's also, for my part, shaped by a sensitivity to the representation of the Spirit in distinctively female terms in non-Western Christian traditions, something perhaps connoted particularly by the image of the dove. It's striking that the one through whom God acts, the one through whom God conceives Jesus, is actually characteristically represented in much Christian tradition as female. That's the way, for example, that the Syriac tradition represents the Spirit. So the final question really is, moving forward, is there a place for a particular sustained attention to the role of pneumatology in this conversation. So thank you for listening, and thank you, Lisa, for coming and being involved with this panel.
So just as a reminder, I'm not Professor Bruce McCormack, but he's very kindly provided some remarks on Lisa's book for me to read. So he writes, I am something of the odd person out on this panel. I'm not familiar with the growing body of literature on disability studies or disability theology. I am by training a historical theologian, by calling a systematic theologian, one who specializes in doctrinal construction. However, Dr. Powell's rich and suggestive book seeks to fund disability theology with doctrinal reflection, so a response emanating from my own field is appropriate. Dr. Powell's arresting thesis is contained in her title, The Disabled God. Such a description of the Christian God would have been impossible on the soil of what is often called classical theism. The concept of the one God, formulated in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, and steadfastly maintained through the 17th century, found its focus in the idea of divine simplicity, which meant, basically, without parts or composition. One of the entailments of this simplicity is that nothing could be added to God. No relation to anything out with God could be formed, such that God would have entered into composition. That this placed severe limitations on the doctrine of the Incarnation is clear. Seen in the light of the absolute simplicity of the eternal Son, the so-called hypostatic union of divine and human natures in Christ could not be taken to mean that the Son had added himself a real relation to the human Jesus. The relation of the person of Christ to his humanity is strictly ideal, notional. It does not, and it cannot, give rise to a real communication of human properties or experiences to the eternal Son. The net effect of this restriction is to make human communication to the divine person to be figurative, as happens when the ancients spoke of the suffering which takes place in Jesus as his suffering, the Son's suffering, but meant his, not in the sense of the Son being made the experiencing subject of it, but only in the figurative sense of it belonging to him. In an effort to save the appearances, one were to insist that the relation of the person of Jesus to Christ is real, because the person is the whole Christ, divine and human, and not the eternal Son alone. One would still only be saying that human properties and experiences are really and truly communicated to the human nature in this supposed composition. You still wouldn't have a suffering God, a God able to enter a real relation with disability. Ascribing human properties to a human nature is simply tautologous and rather besides the point. Dr. Powell would have us reconstruct this entire theological model. The ancient concept of divine impassibility is one with which she dispenses, and with that, simplicity would have to be surrendered as well, since simplicity requires impassibility. Impassibility is an entailment of simplicity. For if the second person of the Trinity can be actioned upon, then the second person is passible, and a passible God is one given over to movement, not the motionless motion of Origen's simple God, but the kind of motion proper to embodied beings who are constantly moving towards death. And Powell's second person, who for her has an eternal relation to Jesus such that even before the incarnation takes place, the second person is defined by that relation, is called by her the Logos Incarnandus, prior to his assumption of the flesh. The Word becoming flesh. And it is easy to see why she is attracted to this conception, for it opens the door wide to consideration of the kind of flesh assumed. Powell writes, "The Logos incarnandus, the Word to be flesh, is specifically the Logos anticipating the assumption of broken flesh, and a body that is outcast, rejected, and persecuted by social, religious, and political institutions. This, in the final analysis, is specifically who the Logos is, and this is the original free decision of God's determination and constitution, to be a human on the fringe, a human stigmatized, who suffers in the body and also suffers the psychological and emotional pain of rejection and isolation. This is the flesh anticipated from eternity. It is not just that Jesus retained a broken body so that the humanity of God is ever after a wounded and fleshed humanity. God, in God's second way of being, has always been anticipating a disabled body. The eternal primal identity of the Son is not the Logos asarkos, and is not even the Logos incarnandus, but more specifically is the Logos incarnandus fractus, the Word going to be in broken flesh." End quote. The anticipated flesh, which defines the identity of the second person of the Trinity, is said in this passage to be broken flesh, a body that is outcast, rejected, and persecuted by social, religious, and political institutions. This is accompanied by the claim that this is who the Logos is. Limiting my response to Powell's thesis, I will make just 3 points. Firstly, while I agree that the anticipated flesh of the eternal Son is broken flesh, there is a problem, it seems to me, with thinking of this anticipation as the consequence of a determination freely chosen. That conception would treat the word determination not as a modifying feature intrinsic to identity, but as something added, with the further consequence that a before and after relation is established by the original decision to be something other or more or less than the Son was prior to having made it. What re-enters where this conception is upheld is the old classical metaphysical understanding of the members of the Godhead as equal and complete instantiations of pure being. This, and this alone, as far as I can see, is how the Son might reasonably be conceived in a state above and prior to this decision. Moving forward, I would encourage Powell to abandon talk of an eternal decision, as I have had to do in my own work. Secondly, Powell retains the ancient idea of a perichoresis of persons. So far as I am able to tell, she does this to avoid the appearance of having established a subordination of the Son to the Father that has been eternalized. But this move would entail a retreat back into the substance metaphysics Powell is seeking to leave behind. A true co-equality of persons could be purchased in 2 ways, both of which depend on the use of the category of substance. Either the 3 share fully and equally in one numerically identical substance, or each is constituted by its own substance, it being stipulated that all 3 substances are like unto each other in every conceivable respect. But this either-or, which dominated discussions of the doctrine of the Trinity a century ago and on into the 1980s, is itself a relic of an era that could subscribe to substance metaphysics. That is something I think we need to leave behind. Finally, I think Powell would profit from constructing a more complete Christology, one which would pass beyond asserting that the real relation of the eternal Son to Jesus is constituted on the side of the Son by ontological receptivity, to an explanation of how such receptivity might be understood to work in the lived experience of the two in relation. This is a large topic. With only a slight modification, the one announced in my first point of response, I can fully inhabit Powell's basic model of the Trinity. The other 2 points are matters of detail, which serve only to make the basic model more consistent and credible. There can be no doubt, however, not on my part anyway, that Powell's revisiting of the idea of a disabled God is a very timely one which will do a lot of good for a lot of people.
So I'll be addressing this as if I'm speaking to Lisa, who's right here. Lisa, I want to begin by expressing my sincere appreciation for the depth and the rigor of your work. Let me preface my response by saying that I believe all theology, even systematics, is contextual and embodied. As a practical theologian of disability, I work primarily with and out of the lived realities of those on the margins, so it is from this perspective that I offer my comments. I have broadly 2 points of inquiry. The first is on your proposal that God's vulnerability is expressed through this covenantal bond with humanity, a bond that, as you argue, shapes God's very being. This articulation of divine vulnerability is really, truly very refreshing in a world where need is often dismissed as weakness. However, despite recasting receptivity as you have, it still remains a vulnerability that's tied to divine initiative and the need to preserve immutability. You write that our vision is limited by our fear of dependency and the desire to be independent individuals. I wonder if the need to preserve immutability is rooted in another fear, our fear of uncertainty, in wishing to alleviate our existential dread about limitations, our inability to exert full control over the world around us. If we could shore up certainty, that would reduce fears of dependency and the prospect of being vulnerable. Isn't divine immutability, in holding to that certainty, then antithetical to vulnerability? You mention open theism briefly, but do not endorse it. I wonder why, if covenantal ontology is said to be so radically vulnerable and embracing of risk, it would not allow for a God who can be dynamically affected by creation in a relationship of mutual love. This sovereign God knows all possibilities, yet enters into and takes ownership of human messiness with us, inviting co-creation rather than decreeing things. Why not a God who shares in the human condition of navigating unpredictability, an experience familiar to all, not least those with disabilities whose lives are a continuous adjustment to fluctuating circumstances? Now, I'm not saying that all disabled people are disabled in the same way, though the experience of disability is almost always accompanied by isolation, diminished options, and overridden choices. In depathologizing difference and destigmatizing conditions that aren't inherently harmful, we can still grow agency, which does not necessarily take people away from community, but allows a greater rebalancing of power in how we partake of things and partner with one another. Being mindful of ways to broaden the spectrum of access and participation helps to restore and reintegrate people into community. Practically, this may mean hours dedicated to learning non-standard communication styles, or designing assistive technologies, or refitting architecture, or allowing for comments to come in a different format. Marginalized communities are often dehumanized through exclusion from decisions that shape their lives, their voices and choices largely discounted. And By agency here, I mean agency understood as relational and situated, since human beings are inherently connected to others, and any action in self-determination is shaped by our context and always co-created through interaction with others, even in asymmetrical relationships. It involves navigating constraints together, rather than upholding the fiction that we can be free from them, or even each other. To sum up my first query, might not a God who creatively and dynamically adjusts providential care provide a more participatory relational theology, resonating better with the experience of adaptation that is so central to many disabled lives? Adaptability in this framework, then, is elevated from being a merely human trait to a divine attribute. Recognize that you make a strategic decision not to address theodicy directly, which is understandable given the harmful ways disability has been linked to sin. However, there is an opportunity here to engage with the broader realities of systemic sin, social, political, and economic structures that cause suffering and exclusion, which brings me to my second line of inquiry. Your engagement with Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasinha's concept of care webs. It offers an analogy for mutual support, that is, interdependence. Your readers might benefit from a stronger caution against the risk of abstracting this ideal from its material realities. I would have preferred a more explicit recognition of the fact that these are resilient responses born out of exclusion from participating in commonly held social goods. Care webs are both a testament to solidarity amongst the disenfranchised and an indictment of the systemic failures which have forced them to rely on one another just for basic survival. It thus bears prophetic witness to the institutions that have failed in distribution of justice. The activists you reference factor in protest and fierce advocacy as part of what constitutes care. I don't think you deny that, but your work might benefit from a clearer affirmation of this aspect. I also want to qualify that my suggested recalibrations come from the positionality of someone who is intersectional, autistic, and from a much more collectivist background where interdependence in relationality is simply the default template, and where self-determination and activism against the problematic status quo is more often the exception. For me, affirmations of interdependence must be accompanied by the recognition that the interrelating autonomy to shape one's own life is deeply rehumanizing for those who have been historically denied it. In my reading, intersectional disability activists who have cautioned against ableism creeping into their networks do so not because disabled people need less access, autonomy, or independence, but because they've observed segmentation and internal discrimination even amongst the disabled community. Hence the call for recentering and even more radical solidarity in fighting for one another and not losing sight of the fundamental need to embrace difference. In your concluding reflections, you propose an eschatological vision where the categories of ability and disability will cease to exist. This is a hopeful image of ultimate reconciliation, where distinctions that divide us no longer have meaning. However, in speaking of figurative futures, there is a danger of moving too quickly past the empirical realities we presently face. Categories of able and disabled are social constructs tied to dominant systems of biopolitical power. Oppressed groups, whether female, disabled, Black, brown, indigenous, queer, poor, have had to politicize identities in order to achieve solidarity with one another as they come together to resist systemic oppression. The very act of naming oneself as disabled or queer is a political act of reasserting equal worth in the face of a world that has devalued or erased us. Identity politics, then, is not meant to be divisive. It is reclaiming ownership over one's historically dispossessed identity in societies that have normatively assigned values according to templates that we don't conform to. It allows us to define ourselves rather than being defined by a world that both consciously and unconsciously sees us as less than, and provides the corrective means to track patterns of bias and prejudice suffered by particular types of people. Recognition of such categories today are critical to the ongoing struggle for recognition, reparations, and recalibrations, and should not be easily diluted. Bonhoeffer's distinction between the ultimate and penultimate is instructive here. Whilst we live in the penultimate, we are called to prepare for the ultimate through deliberate ethical action. For a disability theology to claim itself as liberative, it must confront head-on these conditions of disenfranchisement. I wonder if your proposal would benefit from a stronger spotlighting of the theological task at hand for all of us who have the privilege to think about theology. To put this into practical terms, how can each of us, in our local communities, churches, Christian institutions, and divinity schools, intentionally level the field by contesting ableism, sexism, colonialism, racism, and homophobia? Perhaps by amplifying unheard voices, reconsidering resource allocations, policies, monitoring ourselves and each other kindly for unconscious biases, which are natural to the human brain and cannot be denied. How can we work to maximize the participation of those sidelined and overlooked? How can our theological reflection confront oppression and apathy, moving more decisively toward liberation by attending to the barriers that disable people more than they have to be and which perpetuate conditions of precarity? Can our theology do more than point towards future hope? Can it galvanize us into action for the present work of justice along the way? Thank you again, Lisa, and I look forward to continuing this dialogue.
Wasn't sure if there was like a moment of moderation or something. Okay. All right. Get a little water. All right. Well, thank you to all three of you for doing a close read of my book. It's a thrill, of course, to have anyone engage your work. So I'm just honored that you took the time to do so. So thank you. I did not prepare responses in advance because I was hearing these papers at the same time you all were. So I jotted some notes down, but this won't be a formal response. So I'm just gonna go through a couple notes and then we'll take that break and then come to questions. Grant, thank you so much for such a generous reading of my book. I was thrilled to hear that you seemed to appreciate it. So thank you for that. I think you focused a bit on Imago Dei and how Jesus is the image of God and how that can be useful. I would be really curious to hear more about how you see that working, especially in the context of autism and affirmation of full humanity of people with autism. On my plane ride over, I was reading through my journal and I had some notes jotted down from AAR in like 2014 and happened to read it as I was on the flight. And I wrote down that Catherine Tanner, when we were discussing her book, Christ is Key, says that Imago Dei is incomprehensibility. And I really want to go back and reflect on that more. Obviously, I just was reminded of it just now, so I haven't thought that through, but I understand that category of Imago Dei as being such a fraught and dangerous category. In fact, I try to avoid it. When I teach it to my students, I just tell the history of all of the ways that theologians have labeled exactly what this is and how that has been used to oppress different people and of different groups for centuries. And so it's a category that makes me really nervous. And I never want to try to say, what is it? Is it relationality? Well, dolphins are also relational, or, what's this human uniqueness? Even the category of human uniqueness, I'm a bit uncomfortable with. We could probably hear more about that in the question time, but the idea that Imago Dei is God's incomprehensibility and our incomprehensibility, I think, is really beautiful and maybe promising. And I need to go back and read Christ the King again. But so thanks for making me think about that, especially as it relates to people with autism or the autistic. And then you asked about pneumatology, and I love. You're right. I don't. It's Christology, Trinity, and Liberation. So I don't have a chapter on pneumatology, and it is a bit underdeveloped. One note of interest to me is in John Swinton's critique of Eiesland. One of his critiques is that how can the resurrected body of Jesus be identified as disabled, because it seems to actually be super able. And he identifies, because Jesus passes through walls, and right, he appears and disappears. His body seems, to have superpowers, and he identifies Jesus's resurrection as showing Jesus's superpower, that he resurrected himself, was sort of the suggestion. In the book, I respond by saying, well, I mean, the tradition always it's God or it's the Spirit. It's never Jesus resurrecting himself. And so I think that alludes to what is behind the scenes in this book around the role of the Spirit, who is the most powerful of the three, probably, if we were to sort of divide up the roles of the three persons. Or it's the Spirit who makes the incarnation possible. It's the Spirit who resurrects Jesus. It's the Spirit who guides the humanity of Jesus to keep Christ on the path to our redemption. So God risks a lot on this this election, and the Spirit is sort of running the ship, so to speak, I think. And so there's, especially thinking of the Spirit in terms of the feminine, which there's certainly lots of work around that. It could, work to maybe upset that binary. Of course, when we think about the doctrine of the Trinity and how little attention the Spirit gets, including in my own work now, I'm ashamed to say it. But the Spirit being the one who's almost always left out, or in all of the paintings, is always just like a little dove that you can barely find, in the painting of. That includes a dominating Father, and then a huge picture of Christ at his baptism or at his crucifixion. There's like a little dove, and that's the feminine, sort of not usually depicted as the one with power. So identifying the feminine in the Spirit could be really positive, because the Spirit is the one who is most maybe powerful in this way of thinking of the Trinity, but also because of this history of the Spirit usually being lost and not that significant. Making the Spirit feminine has also its limits, but I think it's certainly worth thinking more about. So thank you for that. To Bruce's comments, Dr. McCormick, I feel like I need to read that. I need to have the paper in front of me to unpack some of his comments, though I was really flattered that he was as affirming as he was. He says that I rely on a doctrine of perichoresis, and that surprises me, and I need to go back and look in my index, because the only time I remember talking about a perichoresis is I say a kind of like a perichoresis of giving and receiving, but I didn't mean it in terms of the way it's often defined of I pour, the Father pours out life into the Son, and the Son pours the Son's life into the Spirit, and all around, and the dance of the Trinity that is the perichoresis. I meant more in that the way that their personhoods are determined. The Father receives the Father's identity as Father because of the Son. So there is a mutuality of giving identity, not in a substance metaphysics. At least I don't think so. So I'd have to go back and look and see, because I don't remember making much of perichoresis, but I could be wrong. I haven't read the book from cover to cover, since I submitted it to the publishers a couple years ago now. So I'll have to go back and look. I have a lot more comments on Audrey's response, so I probably need to keep it short, and we can have more conversation. The first point was why do I hold on to immutability? And I guess I'll just say I don't think of it as this grand ancient view of God cannot change, because it's very clear that God as Son can and does change, and can and is affected truly by experiencing real human life. And so I'm just, I think it's like it's a weak immutability, not a grand scheme of God being unchanging, because God, I think Bruce said I should stop using the word determined or something, but anyways, I'm still using it. That God self-determines to be affected, and so God, in a sense, determines to be able to be affected via the real human experience as Son. So it's like a kind of a sneaky way of saying God's still immutable because God chose to experience this humanly. But the reason I hang on to immutability is because as Grant noted, it's a very Christocentric book, for better or worse. For some, that's for worse. But I really hang on to the doctrine of revelation and believing that if God is just completely open, and we don't have that to rely on, that this is who God determined to be affected by God's human experience as Son, and sort of, I guess, limiting that to some extent to God's experience through the Son as Son. I'm not sure how we can rely on revelation in the same way. So I trust God's revelation in Christ and the Spirit as being true to who God is. And I wonder in what sense that revelation is undercut, or how reliant can we be on that revelation if there isn't some sense of some immutability. Though certainly, as McCormick noted in his words, I still believe that God is passible, so God can suffer. So it's not your sort of traditional or typical doctrine of immutability. I'll take the criticism on not giving enough attention to the care webs and the context in which those emerge in communities of disabled persons. I try very hard, or I talk a lot about not wanting to romanticize disability, and that is a part of my chapter on Eiesland, and the concern about, making it seem like this beautiful thing when a lot of times it comes through trauma. And the care webs emerged because of, like you note, the failure of systems and the failure of society. So I'll just take that and say that sounds right. I probably could have been more careful in the way that I draw from that as a metaphor almost for what it could look like if we were eternally, truly interdependent together. And then lastly, okay, so the final critique was maybe need more clear policy, or how do we respond as a church? And I mean, I knew that was a weakness of a book in systematic theology. It's not a book in practical theology, and I'm not a trained practical theologian. And I do say at the outset of the book, like, some people are going to be disappointed because there's no policy proposals here. I do believe that the way we image God does impact the way we view the world and what we value. And I take a lot from Alison Kafer, and she does play a big role in that chapter. She talks about how we imagine disabled futures impacts the way we treat disabled people in the present. And so she really encourages that we envision different, better futures for people with disabilities. And so that's part of sort of the jumping board for this imagining. And it is an imagining. I mean, eschatology is almost always thought experiment and involves a lot of speculation historically. And so this is just sort of like my gift of what if, you know. She plays a bit with those sorts of, you know, of an else when, an else when where disabled lives are truly valued. And so that's what I was attempting to do there in the final chapter, was imagine a different future, an eschatological one, and it's not one in the present. And so that's, I think, where it falls short, is it's not talking about getting rid of people's identities and identity categories or identity politics and all of that does for us in terms of activism and making real policy changes, but that maybe someday in some eschatological resurrected life together, those categories cease eventually to have the same significance that they do today, because social oppression ceases to exist. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you all very much, Lisa and Hannah, Bruce, Audrey, and Grant. Thank you so much for the presentations and the responses. As we said in the beginning, we will have a 5-minute break now. Please do scan the QR code that you will see on the screen, or the link in your Teams that will take you to Mentimeter. That is the way to ask questions. We do have some time for questions, so please, during this break, take some time to process what has been said. And please do take time to ask a question. The questions will come to me. I will moderate the Q&A after a short break. Thank you. Welcome back for the Q&A. Some questions have come through, which I will read here. And you can still type your questions, and they will come somehow mysteriously on my screen. So keep asking your questions using the Mentimeter. Just to be clear, we're not taking any questions just from the floor. Just if you want to ask a question, use Mentimeter. Thank you. So the first question is probably addressed to Professor Powell. It doesn't say, but I think it is. Might discussions of resurrected bodies tell us more about prevailing attitudes to human identity, especially who and how we are in the here and now, than they do about eschatological bodies? Yeah, sure. No, it's my accent, probably. Might discussions of resurrected bodies tell us more about prevailing attitudes to human identity, especially who we are in the here and now, than they do about eschatological bodies?
Yeah, that's almost a yes or no question. Might our ideas about the resurrected body tell us more about our ideas around bodies here in the present? I mean, there's just what theologians have said over the centuries about what they expect resurrected bodies to be like. certainly suggests that their speculations about the resurrected body reflect their cultural ideals about human bodies in their context and in their time. So yes, and that's certainly part of why I think Nancy Eiesland saw the benefit of saying impaired bodies are welcomed into the eschatological life, because it is a way of saying your body right now is God is good with it. Like it's okay, and you are imago Dei now, and you don't have to change and become something else in order to enter into life with God. So she certainly would agree that it does reflect our present values.
Thank you for that. And I guess here's a question that is related in a way. And that question is, how do we prevent talk of eschatology from becoming theodicy?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
Shall I repeat it?
No, I understand your words.
Right.
How do we prevent eschatology from becoming dealing with the problem of evil?
Well, the way
it's unclear to me.
I can interpret it, it's not my
Okay.
question, but I can
Yeah,
interpret it. The
okay.
way I read it is almost the flip side of your answer that you just gave to the previous question. In the way I interpret it is that if the eschatological body is somehow perfected, the better version of what we are now, as it were, then that implies that somehow our bodies now are not that perfect, and we are suffering for whatever reason or whatever. So I guess it plays on that kind of difference between the perfect maybe in square quotes body and not.
Right. The sort of the assumption that disabled bodies need, or body minds need, a theodicy to justify their existence. A lot of theology historically has said impairments only entered the created world because of sin entering the world, and otherwise we would have had no sickness, right? And no human difference in terms of different embodiments as it relates to what we would call impairments or disabilities. So that's a big problem with the way that theology traditionally has thought about disability as being a result of sin. So the question sort of suggests that link, which I don't go into theodicy quite intentionally in the book, but I think it is something that will have to be addressed at some point. What's the doctrine of creation behind this? What's the understanding of sin and redemption here as it relates to this? So yeah, I don't know if I answered that question. I tried.
I think you did. So maybe staying on the topic of the bodies that we have in the present, and this is a question for you again, Lisa. When we talk about Christ, we seem to forget that he occupied a male, masculine presenting body. How might this impact how, for example, a disabled woman sees their relationship with God?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be the issue for any Christocentric theology, and I probably don't spend a lot of time on that, and this isn't the first time someone has raised a concern that I don't seem too concerned that Jesus is a man. And it kind of goes back to some of the critiques of Eiesland when people say, well, if God is disabled, then I'm able-bodied, I can't relate to God. And so I just go back to sort of like the work of Rosemary Radford Ruth, or can a male Savior save women, and insist that it is the humanity of Jesus that is essential to his nature, not his maleness. But I know that that's not good enough for a lot of women. I probably, it's just no longer a hindrance for me. Father God is more of a problem for me than Jesus had to be, something. There's lots of great arguments by feminist theologians about if a God came as a female and lived a life of sacrifice, God would have been, she would have been met with a colossal shrug, right? Like, oh, another woman, right? So there's the argument that, it only really made sense in that context. And there's great work in feminist theology. Elizabeth Johnson does some good work on that too. So I don't have unfortunately, I don't have a great response, because I think in a lot of ways, this book for me was sort of, as I say in the intro, in many ways was sort of this way of thinking about God helped me love God more. And so it's sort of just like a working out of my faith in a way. And that just, for me, isn't a big hindrance to my faith. It's not hard for me to get around that. But, I'm not going to be praying to God the Father personally. But so sorry for all of those who find Jesus' maleness a hurdle. And I hope there's some good people out there doing work that do a better job dealing with that than I did.
Well, thank you. I'm wondering, Grant, without wanting to put you on the spot, which I'm now doing anyways, I realize, but you have worked a lot on Christology from New Testament perspective in particular. Is there anything that you might have come across these, or you will have come across these discussions, I guess. Is there anything you want to add to this? You don't have to, but I'm putting you on the spot, so you don't have to.
So I'll do what I probably always do with my PhD students, which is just go and ask them to read something else. But there is what I think is actually a really important essay by Trevor Hart, whose point is very specifically on the necessity of particularity, by which he means that the one thing that is universal to all human being is that we are particular human beings. And that as particular human beings, we have bodies with experiences and with stories. Those bodies may be both self-identified and identified by others in ways that are actually quite fluid. So we may identify ourselves differently at different stages in our lives. And we may be identified by others in different ways at different stages through our lives. But the one thing that's necessary to being a real human is that you're particular human. So Trevor's point really is that there's simply no way around the particularity. Now that still leaves a whole bunch of conversations about how we might have conceived things differently if the Logos were united to a woman or to someone who identified still differently. But I think the particularity remains. And I think once we acknowledge that, it then becomes interesting to talk about the various ways in which the gendered identity of Jesus itself actually is represented in quite fluid terms. Arguably in ways that open categories for what Amy Peeler has done, for example, with a kind of intersexual identification of Jesus. So I think there are ways of doing it, but always what it comes back to is the fact that to be a real human being is to be particular. And that has raised all kinds of problems for theology through the centuries, but you can't get around it.
Yeah. Thank you, Grant. That's really helpful. And if you didn't catch the name, that was an essay by Trevor Hart, I think. Great. A question to all of you then. How do you think we can ensure that theology of disability is not a marginalized discussion as a single specialized topic? How can we make it more, quote unquote, mainstream? I don't know who wants to kick off.
I was looking at Audrey. You haven't had this. Well, obviously that's part of the hope of my book personally, was that maybe some systematic theologians would read it and take it seriously. I mean, I think any theology of liberation, or that identifies in some way with personal identity, is often, pushed to the periphery or into I call it the theological sideshow, but where they're doing their thing over there and we're all doing serious stuff here. I think we just need to keep doing serious work and in our own circles continue to raise the questions and remind everyone that they're embodied and their body has limits, and these questions, if they're not already very relevant to them, will likely be very relevant to them and those they care for at some point. So I think anyone who wants to take embodiment seriously has lots to learn from disability and from this discourse. So I think just continue to press that. That's my response, but I would love to hear what the others say.
Well, I think at Aberdeen, at least, we do take disability theology quite seriously. Yeah, and I mean, again, given my context, there's often talk of there's contextual theology, there's Asian theology, there's all of these different things, and I do think that it's interesting how the reference point is always kind of systematics is the theology. But it is actually seen that way by many people. I do think that's changing. I'd written kind of a little thought I had, which is that I don't think disability theology is always subversive, but it can be. And it's like crip theology is subversive. And when we have crip readings and queer readings, I don't think we are trying to necessarily supplant a mainstream interpretation, because the purpose of a marginalized reading is to disrupt dominant narratives rather than trying to become one itself. And so the critiques exist to question and destabilize harmful norms and to resist the idea that there's kind of a single and authoritarian interpretation. So I think the emphasis is on plurality of perspectives and the ongoing need that we all have to do a critical reflection together, rather than trying to impose authoritative and authoritarian paradigms on each other. So yeah, that's my kind of thought on that. Yeah.
I mean, I guess my own thinking, because I mainly work in New Testament, tends to come back to the way in which presumptive normalcies are frequently challenged in various parts of the New Testament. And really, because as soon as you worship, as soon as you identify a crucified failure as your object of worship, your standards of everything start to be subject to some change. So, and I think recognizing that invites us to reflect on the ways in which even our theology is so easily mapped onto just accepted social normalcies, accepted ideals, and particularly actually in the modern context, one of those ideals is the idea of autonomy and independence. And to recognize the extent to which our valorization of being the ideal human And correspondingly, our perceptions of what it means to be a suffering human so often circulate around the idea of whether we can take care of ourselves and whether we can live independently. And challenging that as part of the scriptural emphasis, I think, is key. I mean, the other thing I think that often strikes me with the New Testament is any fair reading of the New Testament does not lead you to believe that the church is a particularly safe space, because much of the New Testament writing is given over to offering critique of the way that Christians think about their own faith and the way that they think about their own practice. And that calls us, I think, to rethink everything and to ask, maybe especially in the modern world, whether the way that our society allows us to parcel off areas of suffering and keep them behind closed doors itself makes that even worse. In a world where particular identities will simply be put into particular institutions and won't be held as part of the home or as part of the church, it's an opportunity for an already bad theology to get worse. So I think some of these elements challenge us just to recognize that whether it's disability or other areas of what socially would not be considered ideal, all of these invite us to rethink what's at the heart of our theology.
Great, thank you so much. As they say, time flies when you're having fun, and I'm afraid that we've come to the end of our time. There is many more questions. Unfortunately, we can't answer them now or discuss them now. But this is certainly a conversation that is to be continued. I want to thank all the panel members very, very much, and especially Lisa Powell. Thank you so much for coming over all the way from Iowa to Aberdeen. It's really great to have you with us. Thank you so much. Much appreciated.